Documentary and fictional presentations of reality, or reality as we make sense of it, express potential for film scholars and theorists to consider how horror facilitates dialogue regarding commentary on social change in relation to the bodily experience of the spectator. Horror encourages the viewer to be moved when observing violent motion on screen. Engaging in film studies, this paper speculates on the ways a viewer is moved by the horror genre. While film scholar Jane Gaines comments on documentaries, I suggest we apply the framework of political mimesis to speculative fiction, like horror. In interpreting filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein's language devices and cinematic techniques, I draw from Gaines's notion of political mimesis to suggest that by witnessing and engaging with filmic violence, not only through the lens of documentary, spectators choose to react and thus to act moved on a physical emotional level. Political mimesis reveals how the body might become politicized. In this feat, the body marks the beginning of such politicization as documentary provokes the viewer to engage with the content or overall message. What of the message disseminated in horror then by extension? In witnessing violence in horror, how might the viewer feel compelled to act? How does violence move or influence the spectator? Theoretically, how might political mimesis, borrowing from Gaines's terminology, manifest across genres? In response, I interpret Eisenstein's sense of movement through the scholarship of Luca Arzenjuk in Movement, Action, Image, Montage, Sergei Eisenstein in the Cinema in Crisis, to draw from Gaines's political mimesis to imply that violence depicted in horror moves viewers to think, to reflect, and to act in some way that results in political hindsight. Horror offers social commentary on current historical events. Pairing Gaines with Eisenstein engages other genres beyond the constraints of historical narratives or documentaries. I analyze parallels to segue into a discussion on criticism and reception of horror by integrating Linda Williams's work, Film Bodies, Gender, Genre, and Excess, to investigate spectatorial engagement. This paper examines Eisenstein's October, 10 Days That Shook the World, and later involves the horror film Daybreakers to claim that the viewer's body experiences movement when witnessing grotesque violence in a fictional capacity. On bodily experience, I claim that the Eisensteinian figure in Crisis manifests now as the spectator in Crisis. Film interacts with the viewer physically or emotionally to move and be moved. Mimesis occurs where the viewer mimics on-screen bodies. Cinema propositions an intimacy with the body. Movement is seen and felt in witnessing horror. In political mimesis, the body in film inspires audience reception as the viewer experiences an emotional response, no longer situated in the passive role of witness when a documentary concludes. Similarly, horror objectifies the body to mobilize pain in the experience of watching. For Eisenstein, cinema unites art through the subjective and historical. Through these ruminations, the positionality of cinema recoils by crossing through not only the genre, but other forms of art or expression. Akin to a ricochet effect, cinema bounces from other art forms to find itself. Film pays homage to other genres featuring these characteristics. Convergence becomes apparent in horror. According to scholar Luca Arzenjuk, Eisenstein weaves conflict, instability, and tension into his pieces through montage and literature. By examining theatrical, grotesque action related to Eisenstein's work, the figure in Crisis springs from movement yet remains torn asunder between the non-representative and the abstract. An image assumes a position where visual moments or fragmented perceptions, quote, in affective and intelligible unity, end quote, images unify through montage. Movement, action, and image then articulate these unions to demonstrate divisions arising from contradictions. This philosophical stance on movement conveys Eisenstein's cinematic approaches. Movement comes first, followed by what moves. A figure in motion may refer to an actor's actions through character betrayal or a visceral reaction elicited from the audience, subsequently experiencing movement through watching movement unfold. Movement exercises liberation based on how it may express individuality. Thus, Eisenstein sought to compose a narrative pulling from historical moments representative of conflict and violent intervals. Violent instants, as voiced by Eisenstein, invoke historical resonance, lending into how documentaries might be viewed today or in the past. These documentaries embody movement as a means of expression, sometimes capturing on-screen violence. Struggle between two oppositional sides manifests as a visible, tangible force, often felt in the aftermath. According to Gaines, political mimesis reveals how the body might become politicized. The body marks politicization in documentary to provoke the viewer to interact with content. Political mimicry solicits the viewer's affective response through imagery to paint toil. When viewing a struggle, spectators desire to prioritize doing something over nothing. When the credits roll, viewers contemplate how to act, what to do in response to the message received. Thus, the body takes precedence in a film. Political mimesis demonstrates the effect documentaries produce, further feeding into emotional appeal. Documentations of struggle position the body as a production where scenes depict physical bodies conveying to create conflict and tension and friction. These bodies move as a tangled, disorganized mess through the motions of writing. Physical struggle in film stimulates visceral responses intended to politicize the viewer, wherein the spectator regards this conflict as a response to an antagonistic figure. So upon witnessing actors struggle, and by extension people depicted on screen, viewers may react. Through extrapolation, spectators interpret tension as politicized and even antagonistic. Upon watching, the spectator may enact some type of change, further engaging in movement as a marker of progress in a viable attempt to change the world or make steps in that direction. Realistic approaches to capture historical movement inspire the spectator by containing current modern prevalence. Possibly, political mimesis encourages sympathy on account of film magic mentioned by Gaines. This trick of film magic bestows the illusion of reality, or as real can feel from the viewer's stance. For filmmakers who integrate mimesis to affect the spectator, this technique encourages the activist to mirror those who write on screen. In other words, mimesis inspires how the film is produced and how the audience receives a film. While some documentaries depict violence contingent upon the theme or issues addressed, how might mimesis be applied to other genres? And what comes from witnessing such footage? How does the audience transform into a politicized body swayed by the affective fervor inspired by documentary? Briefly, let's assess Eisenstein's October, 10 Days That Shook the World. This work of historical fiction addresses state power through the excessive inability to overcome the paradox drawn from cruel, destructive violence. Through fiction, Eisenstein mimics the cycle of proletariat life. In this instance, the past, rationalized through historical context, fuels the prevalence of memory to persist into the present. On screen, we witness the carnage and chaos of the past. October's frantic energy carries through frenzied motion, cyclical actions, a bridge rising and falling, a siege upon the Capitol, workers imprisoned and liberated, legislation, and all between. Through an intertitle, October depicts hunger and war at Finland Station, in representing sullen, dirt-covered faces staring back at the audience. As the proletariat parades through crowded streets, views clash and contrast. Like the flood of rebellion, the surge and flow mirror the parade of puppet-like gestures enacted by the people. Brutality is depicted through the grotesque motions of the people on screen. In another Eisensteinian example, Strike, the technique of schematic reduction insinuates massacre, which intensifies the occurrence in the mind's eye of the viewer. As violence incarnate, bloodshed and massacre invoke motion, an action that feeds into a, quote, theatrical grotesque openness, end quote, meant to, quote, instill closure and in this sense appear as remembered in the present of both something overcome and a warning or reminder, end quote. With the grotesque presented as theatrical, Eisenstein contributes to themes of revolution and revolt in the Soviet Union. By acknowledging Eisenstein's stance on the mechanical production of the spectator, we return to the machine producing the body. Eisenstein considered the effects that film hold over a viewer's body, tying into said politicization. These observations on audience reaction to Eisensteinian film let us ponder further bodily sensations attributed to spectatorship. So, Gaines interprets Eisenstein's work as a matter of bodily phenomenon to direct the viewer into a political stance involving both mind and heart. When appealing to compassion, the audience may laugh, cry, experience a deluge of feeling. Perhaps it's this emotional depth that provokes social change due to cinema. Pairing Gaines with Eisenstein allows for engagement across genres. But let's think about Eisenstein's figure in crisis. Cinema fabricates a false veneer, the illusion of movement, and for Eisenstein there exists a crisis of the figure. Crisis implies disconnect, disfigurement of a moving figure. Swayed by the movement seen on screen, so too the body inhabits emotive reactions through said motion. In interpreting Linda Williams's film bodies, certain cinematic genres portray, quote, and affect the sensational body, end quote. Most notably, the viewer's bodily state mimics emotions the filmic body endures. While the viewer might mirror what is seen in the scene, the body experiences something through affective imitation. On the prospect of bodily experience, the figure in crisis now manifests as the spectator in crisis. From documentary to historical fiction to horror, how might this disconnect, this crisis, represent further in the grotesque? What even is grotesque? Often, violence depicted in American films exhibits an interpersonal component where conflict manifests physically through aggressive means. The action done by and to one party affects many. In horror, this impact ventures beyond the limitations of film, since the fictionalized physical act induces reaction through reception. With horror, emotions and senses overwhelm, for, quote, we feel manipulated by these texts, end quote, pulling from Williams. Through spectatorship, the viewer shivers and shakes, either shying away from the carnage or clutching their seat in anticipation. Filmic violence parallels mass media plights, seeking an equivalency between what influences society and who controls society. Horror reframes and rearticulates acts of violence in daily life. In popular cinema, violence allows the spectator to comprehend situations so that the viewer may resist violence but also assume control. To clarify, brutal scenes allow the viewer to process what has occurred in an open refusal to actualize violence. Such a film moves the viewer, physically or emotionally, to engage. Mimesis occurs, where the viewer mimics the bodies on screens. Recall earlier how Arzenjuk remarks upon the recoil in cinema, compared to how distinct genres experience similar reactions. From documentary to horror, movement is seen, then felt. Political mimesis works just as well in the positionality of horror. Horror focuses on the prominent sense of societal disorder, where realistic, frightening situations manifest under the guise of domination or complete utter destruction of human life. There may exist a visible, tangible violence executed by actors, but the danger lies at the crossroads, where acts of cruel, unusual violence become rationalized or humanized. Here, Eisenstein's evocative movement might be interpreted as, quote, a form of violence, end quote. Frantic motion enacts visual violence. How then does horror viewership respond to violence, and how does horror hold a bearing over movement? In this case, horror ensures contact between bodies, where thought and bodies may coalesce or unite, pulling from Aldana Reyes. Horror leverages the on-screen body in effective production. Now, Gaines insisted that political mimesis politicizes the body to urge the viewer to play the role of activist. While horror may or may not encourage activism, the genre motivates reaction. In the production of effect, the viewer does something in the aftermath. Somatic empathy unites emotional, affective experiences of the spectator's physical form and the filmed body. Recall Eisenstein's expressions of movement. Somatic empathy inspires motion. Perhaps viewers reject the film by boycotting its context. Perhaps viewers engage with the pain endured on screen to move their corporeal bodies, shrinking away to assume less physical space to allow the actor, the character, space, even when understood as a work of fiction. This sensation manipulates the experiences of the lived body. Circling back to the figure in crisis, it is the violence that the body on screen withstands in horror that allows the viewer to be moved. This mobilization of pain objectifies the body in film, strategized by horror filmmaking techniques for the sake of audience reception. For Bridget Cherry, filmic techniques inspire reception further, where filmmakers utilizing montage, framing, special effects, and other visually alluring features are able to garner affect from the viewer. Back to the documentary film's magic, horror fabricates illusions that realizes a world close to our own. The scripted world lets the viewer consider how horror offers a distorted reflection of lived experience in contemporary settings. So these depictions of sex, violence, and emotion that Williams mentions focuses on genres that often influence the body. Violence, apparent in horror, gives rise to commentary on modern societal woes, compelling the viewer to consider the relationship beyond bodily experience. Horror fluctuates between powerlessness and power, to pull from Williams. Cinematic narrative inspires audience reception post-screening to reflect on power dynamics or power struggles, and that consideration is the viewer empowered or rendered powerless. By articulating these narratives, films leave a lasting impression on the viewer based on the character or mood conveyed. For horror to haunt the viewer, the piece requires not only the character on screen to move the audience, but the moods conveyed must lend into that movement. Here, I refer to the movement both as an event, sometimes with a political agenda, and as an action that influences a reaction. Yet, what of the masses depicted on screen in fiction? A mass, either as a mob or a group enduring a violent encounter, possess the possibility to inspire movement from the audience. Eisenstein filmed masses rather than solitary characters or characters that stand alone, which perhaps was encouraged by epic sagas in literary tradition. In filming masses, Eisenstein explores multifaceted relationships, seeking to deconstruct boundaries between individuals and collectives. How then does the convergence of masses clump together as bodies producing friction connect to horror? Well, for example, the film directed by the Spierig brothers, Daybreakers, depicts rioting on account of a widespread nationwide blood shortage. In a world where humans face threats of extinction, vampires rely upon the former for sustenance. As blood becomes scarce, the population resorts to drastic measures, rioting in the subway to attempt to salvage and steal the last remaining blood supply. This scene encapsulates frantic movement through pulsing bodies, through the crowd lashing out to ensure survival. Comparatively, can we categorize the scenes presented in Eisenstein's October as horrific? While not categorized as horror, October paints the reality of revolution through the manifestation of violence. On set, bodies surge and swell, populating streets. Both films embrace gore in different ways to inspire a relationship between the spectator and the screen, between the viewer and the actors on screen, moved by bloodshed to respond physically or emotionally. While the emotional pull affects the body on a superficial level, the entirety encompasses a type of engagement that requires the totality. The spectator in crisis herein experiences turmoil. By analyzing Eisenstein and Gaines's works, I incorporate critiques regarding cinematic horror. Upon witnessing extreme displays of gore, why does the viewer feel compelled to react? Moving forward, how might we apply these techniques and theories to other film genres? What can be said for cinematic depictions of violence in fiction? Thank you so much for your time. Here's my bibliography. I'm afraid that I had to cut out quite a bit of content to make room, so I apologize for the missing gaps, and I look forward to the conference. Be well, everyone.